Welcome to another episode of Witty CFB. Your host, Rob Sheply here. And on today's episode, we are going to be discussing the North Carolina Tar Heels and, their expectations this year. And obviously, how do they overcome some of the changes that they're going through this year? Obviously, they lose Drake May to the NFL draft. They lose Tez Walker to the NFL draft. There's some serious coaching overhaul changes, such as, defensive coordinator Gene Chizik getting fired and bringing in Jeff Collins. And also the ACC, obviously is getting better, getting stronger, getting faster, and getting better. And with all that said, obviously there are some serious question marks regarding this team as, for the most part, North Carolina, they've been consistent. I mean, obviously they've always been known more as a basketball school, and with Mack Brown coming back, who, by the way, if you didn't listen to his interview with Josh Pate, great interview to watch, by the way. I highly recommend watching. But in any event, he is one of the most beloved college football coaches, really, I'd say, really of this era. And, I, for one, have always been a big fan of his. And, if anyone can be a believer, I'm just a big believer in him. But, what North Carolina does have going for him this season, obviously, they're going to have a pretty competent offense. I mean, yes, they lose some of those pieces that I kind of alluded to, absolutely. But you do have Max Johnson coming in, who I do believe is probably more talented than Connor Harrell, who's been on the North Carolina depth chart for the past couple years now, has tried to work his way up. But at least in this day in college football, you do kind of see experience definitely being more valued, whereas 10, 15 years ago, you could be a lot more likely to take a gamble on, a freshman quarterback or a sophomore quarterback or somebody who doesn't have as much experience, where you can kind of tie that in and, be a little bit more patient, where now everything is in a much more win-win-win now sort of mode. So when you think about that, and, obviously, some of the biggest question marks that North Carolina had in general were, in terms of just a lot of staff and player over turnover. There's I think a lot of things that come to mind is, even though there are some questions in terms of how long Mack Brown will be there, but at the same time they're still turning out top 25 recruiting classes just about every cycle for the past couple seasons now. So it as from a North Carolina perspective, it definitely gets you excited that there's still kids coming to the program and all that good stuff. But at the same time, I think a lot of the AACC coaches are kind of thinking to themselves, how much longer is Mac really going to go? And obviously, he's going to deflect and say, "Hey, I'm just going to be coaching as long as I love to coach." But I do think that one thing that's going to have to happen is we're going to have to see more of Mac being a little bit more adaptable. Particularly, I think the one thing that's really going to be a big question mark is, to what extent can the defense really sort of, rectify themselves. I think the one thing that I saw in terms of North Carolina's defense last year was just way too many big plays being given up, particularly on the passing side of the ball. And, yeah, particularly on the passing side of the ball. Whereas, for example, obviously one of their biggest games of the year was against North Carolina State, and they gave up 39 points in that game. And also, you think about other games such as Duke is another example. And when you do look at this schedule, I generally speaking, it is pretty favorable. I mean, you probably sitting there thinking about it. Your toughest game this year is Florida State, and you don't have Florida State until I think week 8 or 9. So in that regard, you do have a pretty favorable schedule, to the point where even if the defense is just as shitty as last year, you should, regardless, at least be able to make a bowl game. Now, I think in terms of the defensive side of the ball, I think the defensive line is a little bit lackluster, and particularly that front seven. There are some younger guys there who are simply going to have to get more reps, and during spring ball, and obviously at the beginning of the year, which is a huge positive for them, because for the most part, their beginning of the year schedule is pretty. There's some cupcake teams in there. You have They play Charlotte, James Madison, North Carolina Central, and then their other toughest opponent is pretty much Duke. And, even with all the realignment, they don't have to go and travel to Stanford or to UCal or to anything like that. And then on the other side of the ball, you know, you you're did they probably overachieve a little bit last year? Yeah, I think a lot of people would say they overachieved a little bit, and there are some definite questions that need to be answered. But at the same time, you do also keep O'Marion Hampton, who is their star running back, rushed for over 1,000 yards last year, and so I think in that regard, yes, Max Johnson is going to get some help with having Hampton to kind of rely upon. Whereas, Max Johnson isn't necessarily that guy that's going to, throw 400 yards a game, but he is that guy who is a competent starter, who has experience playing in some of the toughest environments in all of college football. And you also do have a guy who, for the most part, it hasn't worked out with, some of Max Johnson's last stops, but he is relatively a consistent quarterback. And I know if I were Mack Brown in that offensive staff, I would probably say he would have to be the incumbent starter based purely on talent alone. I think even if you just compare him and Harrell together, I would say Max Johnson is probably the more talented quarterback. And I would say he also is the more experienced one. So with that said, you'll probably roll into the year with Mac Johnson. And as long as he stays healthy, he should be the starter this entire year. Now, on top of on top of having O'Marion Hampton back, the wide receiver room is still pretty strong. That's the one thing that I will always give North Carolina credit for is for the most part they have been pretty successful at bringing in a lot of the offensive guys. They have a really strong receiving core there. They have a nice tight end duo and Nesbitt and Cooper Howard Cooper Howard that can kind of take some of that pressure off. And I am going to anticipate seeing a lot more play action this year. I would anticipate seeing maybe some new chances, some bigger chances too. I think obviously, you know, pretty sure Max Johnson was injured at least a little bit last year. So I think that's going to kind of come into question a little bit. But, you know, outside of the favorable schedule and you have some of the offense coming back, I do think the defense is definitely a serious question mark. I alluded to this a little bit before. I think the biggest issue with Gene Chizik in general is that I think a lot of his, schematic schemes and, general kind of technical adjustments, capabilities, or whatever, to me, it just seemed very convoluted from, what I've heard from other North Carolina insiders and even some of the games I watched last year. Obviously, especially too, a lot of the time ACC will get some prime matchups kind of in that, 3:30 to 5 o'clock window. So I did catch some North Carolina games last year. And I think to me, what really kind of came down to was to me, they just looked disorganized. I think there were a lot of just kind of blown coverages and giving up big plays to the point where it just got to a point where, Drake May and company, they can only make up so many points. And after such a strong start to last year, they kind of fizzled out a little bit, where teams were kind of able to, really size them up and realize, like, hey, if we can hold Drake May and company to under 25, 30 points, we're going to win because the defense, is pretty much automatic to give up at least, 26, 27, at least 27 points a game, which, obviously in college you have to give teams a little bit of the benefit of the doubt because obviously it's just a high scoring game. There's more mental errors that are going to be made, which is understandable. But at the same time, when you do have that great of a start and you are on the precipice of competing for the ACC title, and now you have the college football playoff to think about, it's just to the point where North Carolina is not going to be able to move that much more forward until some serious changes are being made. Now, obviously, Jeff Collins, his run at Georgia Tech kind of fizzled out a little bit. I do think he's a solid coach, and I think this hire does make sense in some regard. I think obviously what Mack Brown's trying to really do is focus more on the recruiting side of it, and actually, being a head football coach where, you know, North Carolina does have Chip Lindsey, who has an extensive history of being an offensive coordinator at Southern Miss, at Arizona. He had a stint at Troy for a handful of seasons. So they don't necessarily have to. He doesn't. He can kind of take more of a backseat on that end of it. And then when you have Jeff Collins on that side, it definitely kind of brings together the experience of everybody there. And also, he's an excellent recruiter too. And I do think it's going to take some time for that depth on the defensive line to really come together too. And I do think one thing I'm going to see from Jeff Collins and some of his defenses from before is I do think we're going to see a much more simplified offense. I think we're going to see some um, I would say less predictability in the sense I think we're going to see some more disguises. I'd like to see some more blitz, some more creative blitz schemes, and all that stuff too. Because I think as we got into you know the latter half of the year for North Carolina, I think one thing that really stood out on the defensive side of the ball is I think in a lot of moments they were really reluctant to kind of really blitz the quarterback too much because they knew, okay, if we bring all these guys and and the quarterback's able to kind of read the coverage and beat it, then our corners are left on an island, and a lot of those corners are just simply not talented enough to be able to kind of hold that off, even if it's for 3 or 4 seconds, because you have so many creative, elusive guys in the ACC to the point where if you don't get that quarterback on the first try, they're just going to go out and scramble or run for 15 yards, or they're going to find the wide open receiver down the field. So when I look at this North Carolina team, I would say the positives is obviously a very favorable schedule, particularly on the front end of it. And you also don't have nearly as much travel. And you also, on the other side of it, you do have Max Johnson coming in. You do have some solid quarterback depth behind him with Connor Harrell and Jacoby Criswell in case he does struggle. You have those two quarterbacks there. You bring in you have O'Marion Hampton coming back, who's going to take off a significant amount of pressure off of Max Johnson, the entire offensive line, really. And on the defensive side of the ball, I definitely think there are some serious questions there, particularly in terms of just overall depth. Like right now, they're simply not good enough to kind of be in a serious contention for the ACC championship. However, there is enough there to say that, you know, has Mack Brown made some questionable assistant hires in the second stint in North Carolina? I think more than enough North Carolina fans would say, you know what, I would probably have some question marks in terms of some of the hires that they made. But in any event, I do think Jeff Collins is a hire that's going in the right direction. He has a proven track record of being able to coach in the ACC and also extensively on defense. And as long as you have Mack Brown continue to recruit some very strong recruiting classes, I do think this will be kind of more of a transitional year in the sense of, yes, we're going to see North Carolina in a bowl game somewhere in that 6 to 8 win margin. But in order for them to take the next step, I think this entire group kind of needs to mingle together. Collins' defense needs to kind of you know simplify and let the defense kind of mesh together. And then once when all of that comes to fruition, I'm excited to see what kind of classes North Carolina can bring in after that, and also for how much longer are we going to get Mack Brown as a head coach at North Carolina.